This is An Uneasy Inheritance, My Family and Other Radicals by Polly Toynbee. She's playing on the Gerald Durrell title, My Family and Other Animals there. Basically, Polly Toynbee is pretty well known as a journalist. She's been working for The Guardian for quite a long time now, and her sympathies are on the left, and she reports on social conditions really. She's an anti-poverty campaigner. She writes about the work of about the nature of hard manual work and low pay and all those sorts of issues. She's quite confrontational with people who are on the political right, and is quite disliked or even detested by people in that place on the spectrum. She comes from a long line of ancestors who occupied a kind of upper middle class or even wandered into the aristocracy, and many of whom were passionate about social reform and various progressive issues of their day. However, this is a warts and all book, and she describes, as she researches some of her ancestors, I mean, they were senior academics, politicians, journalists, but many of the men also had alcohol problems, and they were burdened by what she calls the oppression of virtue, many of them. In other words, by trying to do good, by siding with the underdog, by campaigning, they often drove themselves either into alcohol or into insanity. One of her great-grandfathers, I think it is, Harry, he's so broken by his inability to make more progress on social issues and deprivation and poverty. Whatever he tries to do, he feels it's a drop in the ocean or less, and that he ends up in an asylum very early on and lives the rest of his life there, broken by his inability to do as much good as he wants to do. Now, Toynbee is often criticised by those who don't like her stance as being a champagne socialist or a hypocrite, or somebody who has an easy life and berates others with an easy life but doesn't do much to change her own. And she's honest about that. She tackles that issue straight on. The book is about the difficulty of being socially concerned, sticking up for the underdog, when you yourself live a fairly privileged life. I mean, she and a number of her ancestors have done good works and have not behaved in a selfish way, in a self-justifying way, but she does wrestle with this dilemma here. She says that her opponents on the right wing don't have this struggle, don't feel uncomfortable about their privilege, don't feel the need to justify it, or they justify it in ways that she doesn't accept. Toynbee had an interesting history. Her father, Philip Toynbee, was a communist. He knew Maclean and Burgess. He was a literary critic for The Observer, but he also had a terrible alcohol problem. Her parents divorced when she and her sister were quite small children. They spent their life shuffling between a shambolic cottage in Suffolk where her father lived, which had no electricity, but was nevertheless still seen as posh in the village. And then her mother, who lived in a grand crescent in London and had social aspirations. And she wandered between these two very different settings with these two very different parents, and she describes that very, very well. She was packed off to a posh boarding school near Bristol, which she hated, and she did things like organise the young CND group there, and finally got out of there, left there, and did her last 2 years in Holland Park Comprehensive School in London, and managed, because she loved the English teacher there, managed to pull her socks up academically and go to Oxford. But in Oxford she fell pregnant and she gave up her degree, and she's often criticised for not having a solid academic background because she didn't finish her undergraduate course at Oxford. She got a job as a journalist, and she's under no illusions that this job was hers because of her family connections and the people who knew her father, etc. So she doesn't. She starts off the book saying she's searched and searched in her family tree, looking for anywhere where there is a working class connection somewhere in her ancestry, and she can find none. She can find none, and she says she's unable to say that she pulled herself up by her bootstraps from humble beginnings, and that's what's made her what she is today. She's quite honest that privilege manages to pass privilege on, usually, unless in her case insanity and drunkenness intervene perhaps, and even then not always fatally. Toynbee has done a lot of research as a journalist into the lives of people living very hard lives with really demanding and very low paid jobs, and she took herself off in the early 70s and worked in a series of what you might call menial jobs to understand and to write about people's lives. And she then, and again, she's not under any illusions that her experiences are the same as people who could only do that. She knows she can go back to her much more comfortable life. So she's not, I don't find her hypocritical. I find her very honest, and she does agonize about this position, but she also does good work. She returned to live in a very deprived council block in South London 30 years later, and took on other very low paid jobs. She says the hardest of these was being a care assistant, but she was also a nursery nurse, and she worked in factories, and she relates this experience to various bits of anti-poverty legislation that was brought in under the last Labour government, and she talks about the successes of this and the challenges and where that's not worked so well. But she's also angry at the way in which the austerity regime, which came in 2010, took away these initiatives and left people really struggling again to cope with difficult lives. I think if you're on the left, and Polly Toynbee doesn't always have friends on the left. She broke away from the Labour Party in the early 1980s and was one of the founder members of the SDP. So I think some folks on the left of the Labour Party haven't forgiven her for that. She's certainly not popular on the right in British politics, but I think she has tried to be honest about her position and tried to think about what would genuinely bring about social change. She doesn't claim to be right, she doesn't claim to have found the answer, but she does end with a sense of hope that despite all the failures of progressive causes, if you take the sweep of history and within her own family, she looks at the things which taxed her ancestors, and she looks at the issues which we're still facing today, climate of course being one of the very big ones, and she says that although there's plenty of reasons why one might despair, there are also reasons for optimism in that things do get slowly better, but it's a hard struggle. I think this is a good book. I think it would, I really enjoyed it. I felt I was listening to somebody being honest about themselves and their struggles, and I admired that honesty. And I'd hope that people who don't necessarily agree with all of Toynbee's perspectives might also enjoy it in terms of being able to connect with somebody who is trying to make sense and trying to do good. Okay, so I recommend it.